In a world of economic crisis and Great Depression, the water is boiling towards war. Fascist governments are getting into power, and atrocities are happening under our noses, but there's nothing we can do. This is 1933 to 1934, the road to World War. Welcome to Worst Years in History, and on today's episode we'll be looking at the years between 1933 to 1934. In particular, we'll be looking at the hardest year to Great Depression, the Nazi Party's rise to power, the massacre of the Assyrian people in Iraq, the Japanese puppet state of Manchukuo becomes a constitutional monarchy, and finally, millions of Ukrainians die in Holodomor. I'm just gonna say right now, this is going to probably be the most graphic episode we do. Viewer discretion is definitely advised for this. The Great Depression reached its lowest point in 1933. Business was booming in the 20s, however, it all came crashing down in something we like to call the Great Hangover.
I love you, mate. But you want me to help you with your trust fund? Yeah, mate, just give me a piece of paper, I'll sign it. Here you go. There you go. But, did I say I love you? I love you, mate.
Hey, US Stock Exchange, it's Khobhi. Yeah, just listen. We fucked up.
But you have an investment meeting in like 5 hours.
Yeah, that's not gonna happen. By 1933, 15 million Americans were completely unemployed. That made up around 25% of all workers, and specifically 37% of all non-farm workers. A lot of them sneaking on board freight trains, and others putting all their possessions into Model Ts and just driving as far as they can to a city, hoping to find a job. However, many still didn't find any work. In Europe, finding work was also pretty difficult because many European countries were reliant on American loans. When the American banks were forced to close these loans, Germany went into turmoil, and that transitions us into the Nazis' rise into power. The political turmoil was reaching a boiling point, and on the 27th of February 1933, there was a fire. A pretty big fire. A big fire at the Reichstag building in Berlin. Now, the Reichstag building was the parliament of Germany at the time, and the fire was blamed on a young Dutch communist called Marinus van der Lubbe. But there are other speculations saying that it was an inside job. The impact of the fire is that von Hindenburg signed the emergency decree for the protection of the German people the very next day. This suspended democratic elements of the Weimar Republic and put the country in a state of emergency. However, the major consequence of doing this is that it gave the Nazis free rein to legally persecute any political opponents and control the nation through violence and fear. This became ever more exacerbated by the enabling law of 1933. The Nazi Party did not have a majority in the Reichstag actually. They only had about 43% of the actual national vote. However, they put forward the enabling law of 1933 as a means of gaining dictatorial power. Many of the political opponents that stood in the way of the Nazis were sent to the first concentration camp in Dachau, which was established a couple of days before the vote actually, only on the 20th of March 1933. Now, the SA had substantially grown in 2 years. In 1932, they had 450,000 members. However, by June 1934, they had around 3 million. Now, this was a problem for Hitler because the leader of the SA, a man called Ernst Röhm, was suspected of wanting to plan a coup against the Nazi party. When Hitler heard of this internal dissension, he found a way to try and deal with the problem. In fact, he asked Röhm and other leading members of the SA to join him at a hotel in Bad Wiese, Bavaria. Little known to them was that when they arrived at the hotel, they were arrested and executed without a trial. Now, Röhm was initially pardoned. However, later on, he was given either two options: suicide or murder. The only last thing that was needed for the Nazi party to get supreme power in Germany was the death of Hindenburg. And on the 2nd of August 1934, Hindenburg died at the age of 87. With the death of Hindenburg, Germany officially became a dictatorial power, and Hitler became the dictator, or the Führer, of Germany. Now we transition over to Iraq and the Simele Massacre of 1933. Now this concerns a group called the Assyrians. This group are a indigenous Christian ethnic minority in the Middle East, based around Iraq, Iran, Syria and Turkey, and they've been inhabitants of the area for as far back as 2500 BC. Now this is not the first time they have been involved in acts of genocide. In fact, they were decimated by the Armenian genocide in 1915, where 300,000 Assyrians were killed. The Assyrians were targeted in the Dohuk and Mosul districts of northern Iraq. Forgive me if I butchered them names. And they were targeted in 63 villages. They were slaughtered because of religious and military tensions with the Iraqi government. At the time in Iraq, there was a lot of anti-Assyrian and anti-British xenophobia, mainly because Iraq was a former colony of the British, and Iraq had recently become an independent state. However, these tensions boiled over when there was reported fighting and mutilations from the Assyrians, which later proved to actually be false. Regardless, these 63 villages were prime targets of the Iraqi army, and it's estimated that around 3,000 to 6,000 Assyrians were killed by the Iraqi government, and this included men, women and children. In fact, there was also one case where 81 people were killed in one room, and pregnant women were bayoneted and burned. The reason why this case is so significant is because influential lawyer Raphael Lemkin actually coined the term genocide because of this case. Unfortunately, the case is actually very obscure. The problem is that a lot of Arabs, and especially the Baghdadi government at the time, supported the genocide. So official records of what happened are few and far to come between. There's no official memorial commemorating the genocide, either in northern Iraq or in a diaspora of some sort. Luckily, there is a Syrian Martyrs' Day, which is celebrated on August the 7th, and it's a time of mourning for the Assyrian community to remember the massacre. But if you go to the Simele region of Iraq, you could still find bones lying around, skulls lying around in waste areas. A lot of people were not buried, and if so, a lot of bones and a lot of people were burned or buried in mass graves. For a lot of the victims, there has not been a lot of closure coming to this case, and the Assyrians to this day are still being persecuted in this region. Now we're going to talk about the Japanese puppet state of Manchukuo becoming a constitutional monarchy. The Sino-Japanese War occurred in 1937, and this is where the topic of our discussion comes in. During the war, the Japanese committed mass acts of crimes against humanity. Japan invaded Manchuria in 1932, right? And when they invaded Manchuria in 1932, they annexed it as part of the Japanese Empire and they renamed it Manchukuo. Now, it was never really ever recognized as a country by the international community. However, it didn't stop Manchukuo actually existing in the sense of Japan was in control of it. However, because Japan could not officially be in control of it, they actually was able to convince the last emperor of the Qing dynasty, which is basically old China, to become the emperor, and his name was called Puyi. Puyi, being named emperor of Japan, is like Jay from the In-Betweeners being allowed to go into an adult establishment. Although he's allowed to go into an adult establishment, probably still bullshit. The Japanese were the ones who were really in control of Manchukuo. Despite Manchukuo being heralded as this land of ethnic diversity, specifically a land where the Japanese, Chinese, Koreans and Mongols lived in harmony, the reality was actually a lot worse. You see, the Japanese were favored over the other ethnic minorities, and a lot of the ethnic minorities actually went through harsh repression. This could include forced labor on railroads and other industrial pursuits. This can include the Oroken indigenous group being targeted mercilessly by the Japanese government. Manchukuo was actually used as a channel for the Japanese to do opium trade, because Japan had signed an agreement saying that they would not distribute or they would not be involved in the manufacturing of any drugs or any illegal drugs. So they signed that agreement. It was a decent revenue stream for the economy. So they used Manchukuo as a puppet to actually manufacture drugs. One of the problems with the war is that it led to a lot of crimes against humanity from the Japanese. Crimes of Unit 731. Unit 731 was a biological and chemical weapons testing facility. Basically, it started off innocent at the beginning. They were testing for chemical weapons, biological treatments and stuff like that. When the Sino-Japanese War started, they started performing on human beings. So they started doing human testing on men, women and children. These experiments were pretty gruesome. So I'm gonna just go through a list of some of them. So some of the things that they did were weapon tests. So they would test weapons on prisoners, i.e. they would use bayonets, fire guns, throw grenades and use flamethrowers on prisoners. They would get somebody's limb and they'll put it in ice cold water and keep it there for as long as possible until they got frostbite. Literally, as soon as their hands would come out the water, it would feel like when you hit the limbs, it would feel like somebody smashing wood. And we won't go into the nitty gritties, but they would perform live vivisections on prisoners. They would do surgeries on people without any anesthetic whilst they were fully conscious. It got pretty gruesome at points. We're not going to go into it. If you want to do the research on it, I really warn you, because some of it is extremely gruesome. They also did syphilis testing. So they wanted to find a way to cure syphilis. So what they did is that they got prisoners who had the virus and got them to infect other prisoners by rape. Now this would be male and female rape, and they would have to do it multiple times until syphilis was actually contracted by the victims. None of the victims survived. No one survived Unit 731. Absolutely nobody. There was no survivors on Unit 731. And after the war, no one was actually ever charged for anything that happened in Unit 731. In fact, the leader of the unit, a guy called Shiro Ishii. So Ishii died of throat cancer in 1959. He never was charged for any of his crimes, even though he led Unit 731. And in fact, a lot of soldiers and doctors of Unit 731 actually transitioned into careers in politics, academia and medicine, with some of these people having accolades such as the head of the Japanese Olympic Committee, governor of Tokyo, and the president of the Japanese Medical Association. The perpetrators got away with it. And in fact, they were just walking among us the whole time. The last thing we're going to talk about is Holodomor, which occurred in the USSR, specifically Ukraine, between 1932 to 1933. In 1929, Stalin proposes collectivization. They were given quotas, which were normally very extreme quotas, to gain crops so they can be produced and circulated around the country and around the USSR and around the world. Basically, these collectivization projects and these collective farms were used to really boost the agricultural industry tenfold. However, one of the problems that Stalin and the Soviet government was having was particularly with Ukraine. Now, Ukraine had a massive rural economy, and they had become a part of the USSR in 1922. The thing about Ukraine is that a lot of peasants were completely against collectivization. They didn't want to have to give a lot of their crops away, becoming a national problem for the country. The rural community was also heavily linked with growing nationalism and kind of Ukrainian separatism from the USSR. What happened is that Stalin went through this covert operation to suppress these notions of nationalism. The rich peasants, otherwise known as kulaks, were heavily targeted, and they were sent to gulags and work camps on the complete other side of Russia or in any other part of the USSR. The Soviets created a lot of laws and decrees in place that ensured that if anybody spoke against collectivization, they would be labeled as kulak, regardless if they were actually a rich peasant or not. They would be labeled and then they'll be sent off or killed. They needed the rural resources of Ukraine. However, they also needed to weaken Ukraine. Specifically, they blacklisted complete villages from actually receiving any good. In fact, if anyone, including children, were caught with just a few stalks of wheat, they could be arrested or executed by the police. Homes were ransacked for all the food that they could have. So if they had any food, even if it was particularly for goods purposes or for their own personal use, it was taken, including pets. So if you have a cat or a dog, hold them a little tighter tonight. Stalin was very brutal to the Ukrainians. In fact, he didn't just see it as a way of defeating the national movements, he saw it as a way of teaching the Ukrainians a lesson to never ever speak against the government ever again. So really, Ukrainians were trapped during this time. They couldn't go to Russia or go to other socialist republics to actually look for food. It was illegal. Many Ukrainians turned to cannibalism. So survivors of Holodomor actually give very vivid descriptions of cannibalism and how people actually looked for food during this time. For example, I'm going to butcher his name by the way, Motaya Mostova gave a vivid description of how people were dying all over our village. The dogs ate the ones that were not buried. If people could catch the dogs, they were eaten. In the neighboring village, people ate bodies that they dug up. So it shows the extremities of how people were really suffering during this time. The actual statistics of how many people died during this time is very unclear and very unknown. At least 3.9 out of the 5 million people to die from Holodomor were from the Ukraine. Stalin went so far as into hiding this information that in 1937, the administrators of the 1937 census were arrested and murdered because their findings leaked some of the destruction of the genocide. How that affects communities today. There are many memorials expressing commemoration to Holodomor, not just in Ukraine, but also around the world. There's even one in Washington, D.C. That I've seen. As a whole, it's affected relations between Ukraine and Russia severely ever since. In fact, a lot of the tension is still brewed from that time. And Ukraine only really started recognizing that Holodomor occurred in the mid-80s. And because of the suppression of the Stalinist government and other communist governments after Stalin, actual recognition of the Holodomor actually ever happening was not actually there at the time. It only came decades after it actually happened. Fortunately, we are out of time today with today's video on 1933 to 1934. We hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please like the video, please share as much as possible, and it will be lovely if you can subscribe and press the bell icon when you do so. It will let you know when we next upload, and we will meet you at the next worst year.